18-year-old Madison Pierce sat in the witness stand with the kind of confidence that made the courtroom feel cold. She adjusted her collar, smiled faintly at the defense attorney, and repeated the same story she'd told a dozen times before. She hadn't been there. She hadn't seen anything. She didn't know how Rachel Thornton died. The jury watched her carefully. Some leaned back, others frowned. But Madison didn't flinch. She believed every word she said would send her home that afternoon. She believed her polished testimony, her clean appearance, and her tearful denials would be enough. What she didn't know was that the one person who could destroy everything she just said was sitting 3 rows behind her. And when her mother stood up to speak, the entire room went silent. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began. Madison Pierce had always been the golden child. Straight grades, debate team captain, a girl who smiled at teachers and volunteered at church fundraisers. But beneath that polished surface was something nobody wanted to see. A temper that flared in private, a jealousy that burned quietly, and a friendship with Rachel Thornton that had turned toxic long before that terrible night. Rachel had been found in her bedroom, unresponsive, with injuries that didn't match any accident. The investigation pointed to someone Rachel trusted, someone who had been in that house before, someone whose fingerprints were found where they shouldn't have been, and that someone was Madison Pierce. But Madison wasn't worried. She had rehearsed her lines. She had her story straight. She thought the system would bend for her. She was wrong. Madison Pierce wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to see in a murder trial. She was the girl who organized bake sales and tutored freshmen in chemistry. She wore cardigans and pearl earrings. She spoke in complete sentences and made eye contact when adults talked to her. Teachers wrote glowing recommendation letters. Neighbors called her polite. Friends described her as driven, focused, maybe a little intense, but never dangerous, never cruel, and that's exactly why she thought she could get away with it. Rachel Thornton had been her best friend once. They'd grown up 3 houses apart in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. They'd shared secrets, clothes, and dreams about college. But somewhere along the way, the friendship had curdled. It started small. A comment about Rachel's new boyfriend. A social media post that felt pointed. An argument over who got the lead role in the school play. Madison had always been competitive, but with Rachel, it became something darker, something possessive. Rachel had started pulling away, spending time with other friends, making plans without her, and Madison couldn't stand it. The night Rachel died, the neighborhood had been quiet. It was a Tuesday in late September, the kind of evening where people left their windows open to catch the breeze. Rachel's father was working a night shift at the hospital. Her younger brother was at a sleepover. She was home alone, texting friends, scrolling through videos, doing homework at her desk. At some point before midnight, someone came to her door. Someone she knew. Someone she let inside without hesitation. And by morning, Rachel was gone. The first responders found her in her bedroom, collapsed near the window. There were signs of a struggle, a lamp knocked over, books scattered across the floor, a framed photo of her and her brother shattered on the carpet. The medical examiner would later describe injuries consistent with a physical altercation, blunt force trauma that suggested panic, rage, or both. But there was no forced entry, no sign of a stranger. Whoever had been in that room, Rachel had trusted them enough to turn her back. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood. They interviewed classmates, teachers, family friends, and one name kept coming up: Madison Pierce. The two had been inseparable for years, but recently there had been tension, arguments in the school parking lot, whispered confrontations in the hallway. A friend mentioned that Madison had been upset about Rachel spending time with someone new, a boy Madison had liked first. Another classmate said Madison had joked about making Rachel regret ignoring her. Nobody thought much of it at the time. Teenage drama, nothing serious, until Rachel ended up dead. When detectives knocked on Madison's door, she answered with the perfect mix of shock and concern. She said she couldn't believe what happened. She said Rachel was like a sister to her. She cried at all the right moments and offered to help however she could, but when they asked where she'd been that night, her answer was smooth, too smooth. She said she'd been home studying, then went to bed early. Her parents confirmed it. She had homework spread across the kitchen table. She'd said goodnight around 10. Everything seemed airtight. Except for one small problem. Her phone had pinged a cell tower 3 blocks from Rachel's house at 11:47 that night. Madison explained it away. She said she'd gone for a drive to clear her head. She did that sometimes when she was stressed. She didn't go to Rachel's house. She didn't even drive down that street. She just circled the neighborhood and came home. It was innocent. It was nothing. But the detectives didn't buy it. And when the forensic team found her fingerprints on the broken picture frame in Rachel's bedroom, Madison's story started to crack. She said she'd been there earlier that week. She said they'd hung out after school. She said the prints were old. But the angle of the prints, the pressure, the way they were positioned on the glass, told a different story. Madison had touched that frame the night Rachel died, and now she had to explain why. The evidence kept piling up. Security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera showed a car matching Madison's sedan driving slowly past Rachel's house just before midnight. Text messages revealed that Madison had been trying to reach Rachel all evening, sending increasingly desperate messages that went unanswered. Friends came forward with stories about Madison's jealousy, her inability to let go, her need to control every aspect of their friendship. One girl said Madison had shown up at her house crying weeks earlier, saying Rachel was ruining her life by abandoning her. Another said Madison had talked about confronting Rachel, about making her understand how much she'd hurt her. The pieces were all there. The timeline, the motive, the opportunity. All that was missing was a confession. And Madison Pierce wasn't about to give them one. Rachel Thornton was 17 years old when she died, but she'd already lived a life full of warmth and purpose. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, but she had a way of making people feel seen. She remembered birthdays. She asked how your day was and actually listened to the answer. She baked cookies for new neighbors and left little notes of encouragement in her friends' lockers. Her teachers said she had the kind of kindness that couldn't be taught. Her classmates said she made everyone feel like they mattered. And her family said she was the glue that held them all together. Her father, David Thornton, was a nurse who worked long shifts at the county hospital. He'd raised Rachel and her younger brother Owen, mostly on his own after their mother passed away from an illness when Rachel was 12. It had been hard. There were nights when David came home exhausted, barely able to keep his eyes open, and Rachel would have dinner waiting. She'd help Owen with his homework. She'd make sure the house didn't fall apart. She grew up fast, but she never grew bitter. She still found time to laugh, to dream, to be a teenager. And she never let Owen feel like he'd lost both parents. Owen was 10 years old, wide-eyed and gentle, the kind of kid who collected rocks and drew pictures of superheroes. He worshipped his older sister. She was the one who taught him to ride a bike. She was the one who stayed up late helping him build a volcano for the science fair. When he had nightmares, she was the one who sat on the edge of his bed and told him stories until he fell back asleep. The morning after Rachel died, Owen didn't understand why his father was crying. He didn't understand why the police were in their house. He kept asking when Rachel would wake up, and nobody knew how to tell him she wouldn't. The neighborhood Rachel grew up in was the kind of place where people still waved from their porches. Tree-lined streets, neat lawns, a park at the end of the block where kids played until the streetlights came on. Rachel had spent her childhood on those sidewalks, riding her bike, playing tag, sitting on the curb with friends eating popsicles in the summer. Everyone knew her. The elderly couple 2 doors down called her their honorary granddaughter. The family across the street said she used to babysit their kids and never charged them full price. One neighbor said she'd helped him rake leaves every fall without being asked. She wasn't perfect, but she was good, and that goodness made her loss even harder to bear. Rachel had been planning for the future. She wanted to study nursing like her father. She wanted to travel. She wanted to see mountains and oceans and places she'd only read about. She'd been saving money from her part-time job at a bookstore downtown, tucking away a little each week in an envelope labeled "Someday." She talked about going to college, maybe out of state, maybe somewhere new where she could start fresh. But she never wanted to forget where she came from. She never wanted to lose the people who mattered. And one of those people for a long time had been Madison Pierce. The two of them had been inseparable since middle school. Sleepovers every weekend, matching bracelets, inside jokes that nobody else understood. They were the kind of friends people assumed would stay close forever. But in the months before Rachel's death, something had shifted. Friends noticed Rachel pulling back. She stopped posting pictures with Madison. She started making excuses when Madison invited her out. When people asked what happened, Rachel would shrug and say they were just growing apart, but those close to her knew it was more than that. Rachel had started to feel suffocated. Madison's jealousy had become too much. The constant questions about who Rachel was with, what she was doing, why she hadn't texted back. It wasn't friendship anymore. It was control. Rachel had confided in a few people that she was worried about Madison, not scared exactly, but uneasy. She said Madison had been acting strange, showing up places unannounced, asking invasive questions, getting upset over small things. One friend said Rachel had mentioned wanting to distance herself, but didn't know how to do it without causing drama. Another said Rachel felt guilty, like she owed Madison something because they'd been friends for so long. So Rachel tried to let the friendship fade quietly. She thought if she just gave it time, Madison would move on. She thought space would solve the problem. But space only made Madison angrier. And anger, left to fester, became something much worse. The last text Rachel sent was to her father. It was simple, mundane, the kind of message that feels haunting in hindsight. She said she'd finished her homework and was going to bed soon. She said she loved him. She sent a heart emoji, and then silence. By the time David Thornton came home from his shift at 6 in the morning, his daughter was already gone. The house was still. The front door was locked. But when he went to check on Rachel, he found her on the floor of her bedroom, cold and still, surrounded by the remnants of a struggle nobody had heard. He called for an ambulance. He tried to wake her. He begged her to open his eyes. But Rachel Thornton, the girl who had given so much kindness to the world, was gone. And the person responsible was someone she had once called her best friend. The sun was barely up when the first police car pulled onto Rachel's street. The neighborhood was still quiet, curtains drawn, sprinklers just starting to hiss to life. A few early joggers slowed their pace when they saw the flashing lights. One neighbor stepped onto her porch, coffee mug in hand, and watched as paramedics rushed inside. Within the hour, the entire block was cordoned off. Yellow tape stretched across the Thornton driveway. Officers stood at the corners, keeping back the growing crowd of onlookers. And inside the house, detectives were trying to piece together what had happened in the hours before dawn. Rachel's bedroom was on the second floor, a small space with soft blue walls and posters of places she'd wanted to visit. Paris, Tokyo, the Northern Lights. Her desk was cluttered with textbooks and highlighters. A half-finished chemistry assignment sat open next to her laptop. Her bed was unmade, sheets twisted like she'd gotten up in a hurry. But it was the floor that told the real story. A ceramic lamp lay in pieces near the door. A chair had been knocked onto its side. Books were scattered across the carpet, their spines bent, pages crumpled. And in the center of it all, just beneath the window, was the shattered picture frame that would become the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. The frame had held a photo of Rachel and her brother at the beach, both of them grinning, sand in their hair. Now the glass was in shards, some of it ground into the carpet, some of it smeared with blood. The forensic team photographed every angle. They marked the position of each fragment. They noted the way the frame had landed, face down, like it had been thrown or knocked off the windowsill during a struggle. And when they dusted it for prints, they found several. Some belonged to Rachel. Some were too smudged to be useful. But one print, clear and unmistakable, belonged to Madison Pierce. The medical examiner arrived just after 8. She worked carefully, methodically, documenting every detail. Rachel's injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma. There were bruises on her arms, defensive wounds that suggested she'd tried to protect herself. The cause of death would later be determined as a head injury, the kind that comes from a fall or a strike against something hard. The windowsill, investigators theorized, or the corner of the desk. It didn't look premeditated. It looked like a fight that had spiraled out of control, a confrontation that had turned physical, a moment of rage that had ended a life. Detectives searched the rest of the house. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. The windows were intact. Rachel's phone was still on her desk, the screen dark. Her wallet and keys were untouched. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a random attack. Whoever had been in that room, Rachel had let them in. She'd known them, trusted them, and that narrowed the suspect pool significantly. The first name detectives wrote down was Madison Pierce. The second was a boy Rachel had been talking to, someone from her biology class. The third was a former friend who'd had a falling out with Rachel over the summer. But as the day wore on, the evidence kept pointing back to Madison. A neighbor 2 houses down had a doorbell camera. The footage was grainy, time-stamped, and crucial. It showed a car driving slowly past Rachel's house at 11:43 that night. The make and model matched Madison's silver sedan. The license plate wasn't visible, but the shape, the color, the way it hesitated before turning the corner, all of it fit. Another neighbor, an elderly man who couldn't sleep, said he'd been sitting by his window around midnight when he saw someone walking quickly down the sidewalk. He couldn't see their face, but he remembered thinking it was unusual. People didn't walk alone in the neighborhood that late. He thought about calling the police but decided against it. Now he wished he had. Inside Rachel's room, investigators found something else. A small, crumpled piece of paper tucked beneath her desk. It was a note, handwritten in looping cursive that several of Rachel's friends later identified as Madison's handwriting. The note was short, just a few lines, but the tone was unmistakable. It said Rachel was being selfish. It said she was throwing away their friendship for no reason. It said Madison deserved better. The note wasn't dated, but the ink was fresh. It had been written recently, maybe that night, maybe hours before Rachel died, and it painted a picture of someone who felt betrayed, angry, and desperate to be heard. The forensic team worked through the afternoon, bagging evidence, taking samples, photographing every inch of the crime scene. By evening, they had enough to build a timeline. Rachel had been alive until at least 11:30, based on her last text to her father. The struggle had likely occurred between 11:45 and midnight. The person responsible had left through the front door, locking it behind them, either out of habit or an attempt to cover their tracks. And the fingerprints, the note, the car on the camera, all of it pointed to one person. Madison Pierce had been in that room. She had fought with Rachel, and when Rachel fell, Madison had left her there to die. Now the only question was whether Madison would admit it, or whether she'd keep lying until the very end. Detective Laura Brennan had seen a lot in her 15 years on the force, but something about this case felt different. Maybe it was the age of the victim. Maybe it was the quiet suburban setting where people didn't expect violence. Or maybe it was the suspect, a polished 18-year-old who looked like she belonged in a college brochure, not a police interrogation room. But Brennan had learned a long time ago that appearances meant nothing. She'd seen killers in business suits and saints in handcuffs. What mattered was the evidence. And in this case, the evidence was building a story Madison Pierce couldn't talk her way out of. The first interrogation happened 2 days after Rachel's death. Madison came to the station voluntarily, accompanied by her parents and their attorney. She wore a navy sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back neatly, her face carefully composed. She looked tired, like she'd been crying, but her voice was steady when she answered questions. Brennan sat across from her, a notepad open, a recorder running on the table between them. She started with softballs. How long had Madison known Rachel? When was the last time they'd spoken? How would she describe their friendship? Madison answered each question with practiced ease, her tone measured, her words careful. She said they'd been close once, but had drifted apart. She said it was natural, just part of growing up. She said she had nothing but good memories of Rachel. Then Brennan shifted gears. She asked about the night Rachel died. Madison repeated the same story she'd told before. She'd been home studying. She'd gone to bed around 10. She hadn't left the house. But when Brennan mentioned the cell tower ping, Madison's expression flickered. Just for a second. A tightness around her eyes. A pause before she answered. She said she'd gone for a drive. She said she did that sometimes when she couldn't focus. She said she'd circled the neighborhood, listened to music, came back home. She didn't stop anywhere. She didn't see anyone. It was just a drive to clear her head. Brennan leaned forward. She asked why Madison hadn't mentioned the drive the first time they'd talked. Madison said she'd forgotten. It didn't seem important. It was late, she was stressed, and she'd been thinking about Rachel, not about her own movements that night. Her attorney interjected, reminding Brennan that his client was cooperating voluntarily and didn't appreciate the accusatory tone. Brennan nodded, made a note, and moved on. She asked about the fingerprints. Madison's prints on the picture frame in Rachel's bedroom. How did they get there? Madison didn't hesitate. She said she'd been at Rachel's house earlier that week. They'd talked for a bit, hung out in her room. She must have touched the frame then. It was weeks old. It didn't prove anything. But the forensic team had already analyzed those prints. The oils, the angle, the pressure patterns all indicated they were fresh. Less than 24 hours old. Brennan didn't reveal that yet. She let Madison believe her explanation had worked. She thanked her for coming in, said they'd be in touch if they had more questions, and watched as Madison and her family left the station. The moment the door closed, Brennan turned to her partner, Detective Mike Torres. She said 3 words that would define the rest of the investigation. She's lying. Confidently. Over the next week, the detectives dug deeper. They pulled Madison's phone records and found dozens of unanswered calls and texts to Rachel in the days leading up to her death. The messages started friendly, then grew desperate, then turned bitter. One text said Rachel was being cruel for ignoring her. Another said Madison didn't deserve to be treated like she didn't matter. A third, sent just hours before Rachel died, said they needed to talk in person because this couldn't go on. Rachel never responded. But the texts painted a picture of someone spiraling, someone losing control, someone who couldn't accept that the friendship was over. Detectives also interviewed more of Rachel's friends. One girl, a classmate named Emma, said Madison had shown up at a party 2 weeks before Rachel's death and caused a scene. Rachel had been talking to a boy Madison liked, and Madison confronted her in front of everyone. She said Rachel was a backstabber. She said Rachel only cared about herself. Rachel tried to calm her down, but Madison stormed out, slamming the door so hard it cracked the frame. Emma said it was uncomfortable, the kind of thing that made people stop inviting Madison places. Another friend said Madison had started spreading rumors about Rachel, small lies about things Rachel had supposedly said or done. It was petty, vindictive, and completely out of character for the girl everyone thought they knew. Then there was the note found in Rachel's room. Forensic handwriting analysts confirmed it was written by Madison. The ink matched a pen found in Madison's backpack during a consent search of her car. The paper came from a notebook Madison carried to school. And the tone, the phrasing, the barely concealed rage, all of it contradicted the calm, composed version of Madison that sat in the interrogation room. This was someone who felt wronged, someone who believed Rachel owed her something, someone who couldn't let go. Brennan read the note a dozen times, each time finding new layers of resentment. This wasn't just a friendship ending. This was an obsession unraveling. By the end of the second week, the district attorney felt confident enough to move forward. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was strong. The fingerprints, the cell tower data, the doorbell footage, the texts, the note, the motive. It all pointed to Madison Pierce. On a cold Monday morning, detectives arrived at her house with a warrant. Madison answered the door in pajamas, confused, asking what was happening. Brennan read her rights. She said Madison was being arrested for the murder of Rachel Thornton. Madison's face went pale. She said there had been a mistake. She said she didn't do anything. Her mother screamed from the doorway, begging them to stop. But the cuffs clicked into place, and Madison was led to the patrol car, her head down, her world collapsing. She still believed she could talk her way out of this. She still thought her story would hold. But the justice system doesn't run on charm. It runs on evidence. And the evidence had already made its decision. Madison Pierce had spent her entire life being exactly what people wanted her to be. The perfect daughter, the model student, the girl who said the right things at the right time. She'd learned early that appearances mattered, that people made judgments in seconds, and that if you controlled the narrative, you controlled the outcome. Her parents had raised her to believe that success was everything. Good grades meant good colleges. Good colleges meant good careers, and good careers meant a good life. Failure wasn't an option. Weakness wasn't acceptable. And admitting fault was the same as admitting defeat. So when Rachel started pulling away, Madison didn't see it as a natural end to a friendship. She saw it as a rejection, a failure, a crack in the perfect image she'd built. Rachel had been part of that image. The loyal best friend, the person who made Madison look kind and trustworthy. Without Rachel, Madison felt exposed, like a piece of her identity had been ripped away. She tried to hold on. She sent texts, showed up unannounced, demanded explanations. But the harder she pulled, the further Rachel drifted, and Madison couldn't understand why. In her mind, she'd done everything right. She'd been a good friend. She'd been supportive. She deserved loyalty in return. Psychologists would later describe Madison's behavior as a form of pathological attachment. Not love, exactly, but possession. Rachel wasn't a person to Madison. She was a reflection, a validation, proof that Madison was worth something. When Rachel tried to establish boundaries, Madison saw it as betrayal. When Rachel made new friends, Madison saw it as replacement. And when Rachel stopped responding to her messages, Madison saw it as war. She couldn't let it go. She couldn't accept that some things end, and that's okay. Her entire sense of self was wrapped up in being needed, being central, being in control. And Rachel's absence threatened all of that. The night Madison went to Rachel's house, she didn't plan to hurt her. At least, that's what she would claim later. She said she just wanted to talk, to understand, to fix whatever had gone wrong between them. She'd driven past the house twice, circling the block, working up the courage to knock. When she finally did, Rachel answered. She looked tired. She asked what Madison wanted. Madison said they needed to talk. Rachel hesitated, then let her in. It was a decision Rachel would never get to explain, but friends later said she was probably trying to avoid a bigger confrontation. Rachel didn't like conflict. She probably thought if she just listened, Madison would finally leave her alone. They went upstairs to Rachel's room. Madison sat on the edge of the bed. Rachel stayed near the door, arms crossed, already defensive. Madison started talking. She said she didn't understand why Rachel was shutting her out. She said they'd been friends for years, and that should mean something. Rachel tried to explain. She said people grow and change. She said she needed space. She said it wasn't personal. But Madison heard rejection in every word. She felt her chest tighten, her hands clenched. She asked if it was because of someone else. The boy from biology class. The new friends Rachel had been spending time with. Rachel said it wasn't about anyone else. It was about her needing to figure out who she was without Madison hovering over every decision she made. That's when Madison snapped. Not violently at first, just verbally. She said Rachel was selfish, ungrateful, that she'd wasted years on someone who didn't even care. Rachel told her to leave. Madison refused. She said they weren't done talking. Rachel moved toward the door. Madison grabbed her arm. Rachel pulled away, and that's when the argument escalated into something physical. A shove, a stumble. Rachel reaching for the windowsill to steady herself. Madison grabbing the picture frame, not to hit her, but in the chaos of the struggle. The glass shattering. Rachel falling, her head hitting the corner of the desk with a sound that made the room go silent. Madison froze. She stood there, breathing hard, staring at Rachel's crumpled form on the floor. She waited for Rachel to move, to groan, to say something, but Rachel didn't. Madison knelt down, shaking her, saying her name over and over. Nothing. Panic set in. Not the kind that makes you call for help, the kind that makes you think about yourself first. Madison looked around the room. The broken lamp, the scattered books, the shattered frame with her fingerprints all over it. She thought about what this would look like, what people would say, what it would do to her future. And in that moment, she made a choice. She didn't call 911. She didn't try to save Rachel. She wiped her hands on her jeans, turned off the light, and left through the front door, locking it behind her like nothing had happened. On the drive home, Madison's mind raced. She replayed the fight in her head, rewriting it in real time. She convinced herself it was an accident, that Rachel had slipped, that it wasn't her fault. By the time she pulled into her driveway, she'd created a version of events she could live with. A version where she'd never been there, where she'd been home all night, where Rachel's death was a tragedy, not a consequence. And when the police came asking questions, Madison delivered that version with perfect composure. Because that's what she did. She performed. She controlled the narrative. She made people believe what she needed them to believe. But this time, the evidence told a different story. And no amount of charm or carefully chosen words could rewrite the truth that Rachel's bedroom had already revealed. The trial began on a gray morning in late November, 3 months after Rachel's death. The courthouse was packed. News vans lined the street outside, reporters jostling for position, cameras aimed at every person entering the building. Inside, the gallery was filled with Rachel's family, friends, classmates, and community members who'd known her since she was a child. On the other side sat Madison's parents, pale and silent, flanked by a few relatives and supporters who still believed in her innocence. The tension between the two sides was palpable, like a storm waiting to break. Madison entered the courtroom in a gray blazer and white blouse, her hair pulled back, minimal makeup, looking every bit the misunderstood teenager her defense team wanted the jury to see. She kept her eyes down as she walked to the defense table, her hands folded in front of her. Her attorney, Richard Calloway, was a veteran of high-profile cases, known for his ability to humanize even the most damning defendants. He'd built a career on reasonable doubt, and he planned to do the same here. Across the aisle sat Assistant District Attorney Karen Mendez, sharp-eyed and relentless, with a stack of evidence folders that looked thick enough to tell the entire story on their own. Judge Raymond Holt entered, and the room rose in unison. He was in his early 60s, gray-haired and stern, with a reputation for running a tight courtroom. He didn't tolerate theatrics, didn't allow grandstanding, and made it clear from the start that this trial would be about facts, not emotion. He instructed the jury, 12 men and women who'd been selected over 2 grueling days of voir dire, to keep an open mind and remember that the burden of proof rested entirely on the prosecution. Madison would not have to prove her innocence. The state would have to prove her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Mendez stood for her opening statement. She walked slowly to the center of the room, her voice calm but firm. She said this case was about a friendship that turned toxic, about a young woman who couldn't accept that relationships end, about a night when words became violence and violence became tragedy. She told the jury they would hear about fingerprints, cell phone data, eyewitness accounts, and a timeline that left no doubt about who was in Rachel Thornton's bedroom the night she died. She said Madison Pierce had every opportunity to tell the truth, to call for help, to take responsibility. Instead, she lied. She covered her tracks, and she let Rachel's father find his daughter's body the next morning, cold and alone. Mendez walked the jury through the evidence methodically. The doorbell footage showing Madison's car. The cell tower ping placing her phone near Rachel's house. The fingerprints on the shattered frame. The texts that showed obsession and rage. The note found under Rachel's desk. She said each piece on its own might seem circumstantial, but together they formed a picture that was undeniable. Madison Pierce had been there. She had fought with Rachel, and she had left her to die. Mendez's voice never rose. She didn't need drama. The facts spoke for themselves. She ended with a simple statement. Justice for Rachel Thornton starts with the truth. And the truth is sitting at that defense table. Calloway rose for his turn. He smiled gently at the jury, the kind of smile that said he understood their burden, that he respected their role, that he wasn't here to trick them. He said the prosecution had just told them a story. A compelling story, sure, but a story nonetheless. He said stories rely on interpretation, on connecting dots that might not actually connect. He said his client, Madison Pierce, was an 18-year-old girl who'd lost her best friend and was now being accused of something she didn't do. He said the fingerprints proved nothing except that Madison had been in Rachel's room at some point, which she'd never denied. He said the texts showed a friendship in turmoil, not a plan to commit violence. He said the cell phone data was imprecise, the doorbell footage was grainy, and the timeline the prosecution was relying on had gaps big enough to drive reasonable doubt through. Calloway walked over to Madison, placing a hand on her shoulder. He said the jury would hear from experts who would explain why this evidence didn't add up. They would hear testimony about Rachel's state of mind, about other people who might have had reasons to hurt her. He said Madison had cooperated with police from the start, had answered every question, had never tried to run or hide. He said an innocent person doesn't act guilty, and Madison Pierce had nothing to hide. He ended with a plea. Don't let grief cloud your judgment. Don't let a tragic accident become a wrongful conviction. Listen to all the evidence. Consider all the possibilities. And when you do, you'll see that the prosecution's story doesn't hold up. The judge called a recess after the opening statements. Madison sat motionless at the defense table while the courtroom buzzed around her. Her mother leaned over the railing, whispering something Madison didn't respond to. Across the aisle, Rachel's father sat with his head in his hands, his son beside him, both of them looking like they'd aged years in the span of 3 months. The jury filed out, their faces unreadable. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about whether justice could be found in a system built on proving what happened in a room where only 2 people had been present, and only one of them was still alive to tell the story. The trial had only just begun, but the battle lines were already drawn. And Madison Pierce, sitting there with her hands folded and her face carefully blank, still believed she could win. The prosecution's case unfolded over the next 5 days like a puzzle being assembled piece by piece in front of the jury. Each witness added another layer, another detail, another crack in the defense's narrative. Mendez moved through her evidence methodically, never rushing, never overselling. She let the facts build their own momentum, and with each passing hour, the picture of what happened that night became clearer, sharper, impossible to ignore. The first witness was David Thornton, Rachel's father. He took the stand with quiet dignity, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to relive. Mendez asked him to describe the morning he found his daughter. David spoke slowly, carefully, like each word cost him something. He said he'd come home from his shift at 6:15. The house was quiet. He'd assumed Rachel was still asleep. He went upstairs to check on her before heading to bed himself. He knocked. No answer. He opened the door, and that's when his world ended. He described finding her on the floor, cold to the touch, surrounded by the remnants of a struggle he hadn't been there to stop. He said he tried CPR. He called 911. He begged her to wake up. But she was already gone. Mendez asked if Rachel had mentioned any conflicts with friends recently. David said she'd been distant about it, but he knew something had been bothering her. She'd mentioned Madison a few times, always with a hint of frustration. She'd said Madison was being clingy, demanding, unable to accept that they were growing apart. David said he'd told Rachel to handle it however she felt was right, that friendships sometimes ran their course. He never imagined it would lead to this. When Calloway cross-examined, he tried to suggest that Rachel might have had other conflicts, other people who could have been involved. But David was firm. Rachel's only source of stress in those final weeks had been Madison Pierce. And now his daughter was gone. Next came the forensic evidence. A crime scene technician walked the jury through the photos of Rachel's bedroom. The overturned chair, the shattered lamp, the broken picture frame. She explained how blood spatter patterns indicated a struggle, how the position of Rachel's body suggested she'd fallen backward and struck her head. She pointed out the fingerprints on the frame, clear and unmistakable, belonging to Madison Pierce. Calloway objected multiple times, arguing that the presence of fingerprints didn't prove Madison had been there that specific night. But the technician calmly explained that the oils in the prints, the lack of dust or degradation, all indicated they were fresh, less than 24 hours old. The jury leaned forward, taking notes, their expressions growing more serious with each revelation. The cell phone expert was next. He explained how tower pings work, how they can triangulate a phone's location within a certain radius. He showed the jury a map with Madison's phone pinging off a tower 3 blocks from Rachel's house at 11:47 that night. He said the phone remained in that area for approximately 12 minutes before moving back toward Madison's neighborhood. Calloway challenged the accuracy, suggesting the radius was too broad to be definitive. But the expert held firm. Combined with other evidence, he said, the data placed Madison's phone in the immediate vicinity of the crime scene during the window when Rachel was killed. It wasn't absolute proof on its own, but it was another piece that fit too perfectly to ignore. Then came the neighbors. The elderly man who'd been sitting by his window that night testified that he'd seen someone walking quickly down the sidewalk around midnight. He couldn't identify them, but he remembered thinking it was unusual for someone to be out that late in their quiet neighborhood. The woman with the doorbell camera provided the footage that had already been analyzed a dozen times. Grainy, yes, but clear enough to show a silver sedan matching Madison's car driving slowly past Rachel's house just before midnight. Calloway tried to argue that dozens of people in the area owned similar vehicles. But when Mendez cross-referenced the timing with the cell phone data and the witness testimony, the pattern became undeniable. Madison had been there. Her own digital footprint had betrayed her. Rachel's friends took the stand one by one, each painting a picture of a friendship that had become suffocating. Emma, the girl who'd witnessed the party confrontation, described Madison's outburst in detail. She said Madison had accused Rachel of betrayal, of stealing attention, of being a bad friend. She said the anger in Madison's voice that night had scared people. Another friend, a boy named Tyler, testified that Madison had sent him messages asking about Rachel, wanting to know who she was spending time with, what she was saying about Madison. He said it felt obsessive, like Madison couldn't let go. A third friend said Madison had shown up at her house crying one night, saying Rachel was ruining her life, that everything was falling apart because Rachel didn't care anymore. The testimony built a psychological profile that was damning. This wasn't just a friendship ending. This was obsession spiraling into something dangerous. The handwriting expert confirmed that the note found in Rachel's room had been written by Madison. She matched the loops, the pressure, the spacing to samples from Madison's school notebooks. The pen used to write the note was identical to one found in Madison's backpack. And the tone of the note, bitter and accusatory, matched the text messages Madison had sent in the days leading up to Rachel's death. Calloway tried to argue that the note could have been written weeks earlier, that it didn't prove Madison had been in the room that night. But the forensic analysis of the ink and paper suggested otherwise. It was fresh, it was recent, and it was written by someone who felt wronged and wanted Rachel to know it. By the end of the week, the prosecution had built a case that felt airtight. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. The motive, the opportunity, the means, the lies Madison had told to cover her tracks. Mendez rested her case with a final statement to the jury. She said they'd heard the truth from witnesses, from experts, from the evidence itself. She said Madison Pierce had been given every chance to be honest, and she'd chosen deception instead. Now it was up to them to decide whether that deception would continue or whether justice would finally be served. The courtroom was silent as the jury absorbed the weight of what they'd heard. And across the room, Madison sat perfectly still, her face a mask of composure, but her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The prosecution had done its job. Now it was the defense's turn to try and tear it all down. The defense had promised the jury they would hear a different story, a story of reasonable doubt, of misunderstood evidence, of a girl wrongly accused. Calloway had lined up character witnesses, expert testimony, and alternative theories. He'd prepared a narrative that painted Madison as a victim of circumstance, a teenager caught in a tragedy she had nothing to do with. But before any of that could unfold, something happened that nobody saw coming. Something that would change the entire course of the trial. Madison's mother asked to speak. Catherine Pierce had sat quietly in the gallery every day of the trial. She was a composed woman in her late 40s, always dressed neatly, always sitting in the same seat 3 rows behind the defense table. She'd watched the prosecution present their case with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite denial, not quite acceptance, something closer to resignation. Her husband sat beside her, occasionally reaching for her hand, but Catherine remained still, her eyes fixed on her daughter. And as the days passed, something inside her began to break. On the morning the defense was set to begin, Catherine approached Calloway during a recess. She said she needed to testify. He looked confused. She wasn't on the witness list. Her testimony hadn't been prepared. He asked what she wanted to say. Catherine's voice was quiet but firm. She said she needed to tell the truth. Calloway's face went pale. He tried to dissuade her, said it wasn't necessary, said they had a strong defense without her. But Catherine wasn't asking permission. She was telling him what was going to happen. And when court reconvened after lunch, Calloway stood and called Catherine Pierce to the stand. The courtroom went silent. Madison turned in her seat, her eyes wide with confusion. She whispered something to Calloway, but he didn't respond. Catherine walked slowly to the witness stand, her hands clasped in front of her face composed but pale. She was sworn in, sat down, and looked directly at the jury. Calloway stood at the defense table, his expression tight. He started with simple questions: Catherine's name, her relationship to the defendant, how long she'd lived in the community. But everyone in that room could feel the tension building. This wasn't going to be a character witness praising her daughter. This was something else entirely. Calloway asked Catherine to describe Madison's behavior in the days after Rachel's death. Catherine paused, her eyes closing briefly, then spoke. She said Madison had come home late that night, later than she'd claimed. Catherine had been awake, unable to sleep, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea. She'd heard the front door open just after midnight. She'd called out, asking if everything was okay. Madison had said she'd been for a drive, that she couldn't focus on her homework and needed to clear her head. Catherine said she'd noticed something in Madison's voice, a tremor, a hesitation. But she'd let it go. She'd trusted her daughter. She'd wanted to believe everything was fine. The next morning, when the news broke about Rachel's death, Catherine said she watched Madison's reaction carefully. Madison had cried, had seemed shocked, had said all the right things. But there was something performative about it, something rehearsed. Catherine said she tried to push the thought away, tried to tell herself she was being paranoid. But as the investigation unfolded, as the evidence started pointing toward Madison, Catherine couldn't ignore what she'd seen that night. The time her daughter had come home, the look on her face, the way her hands had been shaking when she poured herself a glass of water. Calloway tried to redirect, asking Catherine if she'd actually seen Madison do anything wrong. Catherine shook her head. She said she hadn't seen Madison hurt Rachel. She hadn't witnessed the crime. But what she had seen, what she couldn't ignore anymore, was her daughter lying. To the police, to the family, to everyone. Catherine said she'd found Madison's clothes from that night in the laundry the next day, a small stain on the sleeve. Nothing obvious, but enough to make her wonder. She'd asked Madison about it. Madison had said she'd spilled something. Catherine had wanted to believe her, but she'd kept the shirt anyway, hidden in the back of her closet, not sure what to do with the suspicion growing in her mind. Then Catherine said something that made the entire courtroom hold its breath. She said she'd overheard Madison on the phone a week after Rachel's death. Madison had been in her room, door closed, but the walls were thin. Catherine had been walking past when she heard her daughter's voice, low and urgent. Madison was talking to someone, maybe a friend, and she said something that made Catherine's blood run cold. She said she couldn't believe how easy it had been to convince everyone she hadn't been there, that people saw what they wanted to see, that as long as she kept her story straight, nobody could prove anything. Catherine said she'd stood frozen in the hallway, listening, hoping she'd misheard. But she hadn't. Calloway looked like he wanted to object, to stop this testimony, but he couldn't. Catherine was his own witness. Mendez sat at the prosecution table, perfectly still, letting the moment unfold. The jury was transfixed, and Madison, at the defense table, had gone completely white. She stared at her mother with an expression that was equal parts shock and betrayal. Catherine continued, her voice breaking slightly now. She said she'd tried to talk to Madison, to give her a chance to be honest. But Madison had denied everything, had stuck to her story, had looked her own mother in the eye and lied. And that's when Catherine knew. Not with absolute certainty, but with the kind of knowing that comes from raising someone, from watching them grow, from recognizing when the person you love is hiding something terrible. Catherine said she'd spent weeks wrestling with what to do. She'd lain awake at night, torn between protecting her daughter and honoring the truth. She'd thought about Rachel's father, about the little boy who'd lost his sister, about the community that deserved answers. And she'd realized that love didn't mean covering up lies. Love meant holding people accountable, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. She said she couldn't let Madison walk out of that courtroom believing she'd gotten away with it. Because if she did, Madison would never take responsibility. She'd never face what she'd done. And she'd never have a chance to become the person Catherine had once believed she could be. The courtroom was silent when Catherine finished. Calloway sat down without cross-examining his own witness. Mendez declined to ask questions. There was nothing left to say. Catherine stepped down from the stand, her eyes red but her posture straight. She didn't look at Madison as she walked past. Madison sat frozen, her carefully constructed composure finally shattered. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her breathing was shallow, and for the first time since the trial began, the jury saw something real on her face. Not the polished teenager who'd rehearsed every expression, but a young woman who'd just been exposed by the one person she thought would never betray her. The defense had promised reasonable doubt. Instead, they delivered the most damning testimony of the entire trial, and it had come from Madison's own mother. The defense never recovered from Catherine Pierce's testimony. The rest of that day felt like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Calloway tried to regroup, called a few character witnesses who spoke about Madison's volunteer work and academic achievements, but their words felt hollow against the weight of what the jury had just heard. The prosecution had rested its case on evidence and expert testimony. The defense had been undone by a mother's conscience. And now, as the trial moved into its final phase, the last pieces of forensic evidence were about to seal Madison's fate. On the morning of Day 8, Mendez called her final witness. Dr. Sarah Chen was a forensic pathologist with 20 years of experience and a reputation for meticulous, unbiased analysis. She'd examined Rachel's body, reviewed the autopsy report, and studied the crime scene photos in detail. She took the stand with a calm professionalism that immediately commanded the room's attention. Mendez asked her to walk the jury through her findings, to explain in clear terms what the physical evidence revealed about Rachel's final moments. Dr. Chen began with the injuries. She said Rachel had sustained blunt force trauma to the back of her head, consistent with striking a hard surface during a fall. The impact had caused bleeding in the brain that would have rendered her unconscious almost immediately. She said the defensive wounds on Rachel's arms, the bruising and small abrasions, indicated she'd tried to protect herself during a physical altercation. The positioning of these injuries suggested someone had grabbed her, that there had been pushing and shoving before the fatal fall. This wasn't an accident where someone tripped on their own. This was the result of a confrontation that had turned violent. Mendez asked about the timeline. Dr. Chen said based on body temperature, rigor mortis, and other factors, Rachel had died between 11:30 and midnight. The window was narrow, precise, and it matched exactly with the time Madison's phone had pinged near Rachel's house. Dr. Chen also noted something else. Fibers found under Rachel's fingernails. Tiny threads of fabric that had been sent to the lab for analysis. The results had come back just days before the trial. The fibers matched the material of a sweater Madison had been photographed wearing at school the day of Rachel's death. It was a small detail, but combined with everything else, it was devastating. Calloway stood for cross-examination. He tried to challenge the precision of the timeline, suggesting that forensic estimates always had margins of error. Dr. Chen acknowledged that was true in general, but said in this case, multiple indicators all pointed to the same window. She was confident in her assessment. Calloway then asked about the fibers. Couldn't they have gotten under Rachel's nails during an earlier interaction? Dr. Chen said it was possible, but unlikely. The nails had been trimmed and cleaned recently based on their condition. The fibers appeared fresh, and given their position, deep under the nail bed, they suggested they'd been acquired during a struggle where Rachel had grabbed or clawed at someone wearing that specific fabric. Calloway pressed harder. He asked if Dr. Chen could say with absolute certainty that Madison Pierce had caused Rachel's death. Dr. Chen paused, choosing her words carefully. She said she couldn't testify to who was in that room. That wasn't her job. Her job was to analyze the physical evidence and determine what happened to Rachel's body. And based on that evidence, she could say with confidence that Rachel had been involved in a physical altercation with another person, that she had sustained injuries trying to defend herself, and that she had died as a result of trauma sustained during that altercation. Who that other person was, she said, looking directly at the jury, was for them to decide based on all the evidence presented. After Dr. Chen stepped down, Mendez called one more witness, a digital forensics expert who'd analyzed Madison's laptop and phone in the weeks following her arrest. He testified that he'd found deleted text messages recovered from Madison's phone's backup files, messages Madison had sent to a friend 2 days after Rachel's death. In them, Madison had written that she felt like she was living in a nightmare, that she kept replaying that night over and over, that she wished she could take it back. The friend had responded asking what she meant. Madison had immediately backtracked, saying she just meant she wished she'd reached out to Rachel more, that maybe if they'd talked things through, Rachel would still be alive. But the expert said the phrasing was significant. Madison hadn't said she wished she'd been there. She'd said she wished she could take it back. The implication was clear. She was talking about something she'd done, not something she'd failed to do. Calloway objected, arguing that the expert was interpreting language, not presenting facts. Judge Holt sustained the objection, but allowed the messages to remain in evidence. The jury could draw their own conclusions, and based on their expressions, they were drawing the same ones the prosecution had hoped for. The final piece of evidence was a voice analysis. During one of Madison's police interviews, she'd been asked directly if she'd gone to Rachel's house that night. She'd said no. The expert had analyzed the recording, measuring vocal stress, pitch changes, and micropauses. While he couldn't say definitively that Madison was lying, he noted several indicators consistent with deceptive responses. Elevated stress in her voice, unusual pauses before answering, a slight change in pitch when denying she'd been at the house. Again, Calloway objected, calling it junk science. Judge Holt allowed it with a cautionary instruction to the jury that voice analysis wasn't definitive proof of deception, but the damage was done. One more brick in the wall the prosecution had built around Madison. By the time Mendez rested her case for the final time, the evidence felt overwhelming. Fingerprints, cell phone data, witness testimony, forensic analysis, digital records, and most damning of all, Madison's own mother's testimony. The defense had tried to poke holes, to suggest alternative explanations, to create reasonable doubt. But every piece fit too perfectly together. Every alternative theory fell apart under scrutiny. And the jury, 12 ordinary people tasked with finding the truth, looked exhausted by the weight of what they'd heard. Calloway made one last attempt. He recalled Madison to the stand. It was a risky move, but he had nothing left to lose. Madison took the stand for the second time, her composure brittle but still intact. Calloway asked her directly, "Did you go to Rachel's house that night?" Madison said yes. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Holt gavelled for silence. Madison continued, her voice shaking. She said she had gone there. She'd lied before because she was scared, but she wanted to tell the truth now. She said she and Rachel had argued. Things got heated. Rachel had told her to leave. Madison had tried to explain, to make Rachel understand. And yes, there had been pushing. But she didn't mean to hurt her. Rachel had stumbled backward, hit her head, and Madison panicked. She didn't know what to do. She was terrified. So she left. It was a last-ditch confession, an attempt to reframe the narrative as an accident rather than a crime. But it was too late. Madison had lied for months. She'd let Rachel's family suffer without answers. She'd sat in interrogation rooms and courtrooms and lied over and over again. And now, with the walls closing in, she was trying to control the story one more time. Mendez stood for cross-examination. She asked Madison why she hadn't called for help, why she hadn't tried to save Rachel, why she'd locked the door and driven away. Madison had no good answers, just excuses, just fear, just selfishness. And when she finally stepped down from the stand, even Calloway looked defeated. The trial was over. All that remained was for the jury to decide whether Madison Pierce's lies, her choices, and her actions that night made her guilty of taking Rachel Thornton's life. The moment Madison admitted she'd been in Rachel's room that night, the trial shifted. What had been a question of presence became a question of intent. Mendez knew this was her moment. She'd spent months preparing for this case, studying every detail, anticipating every defense strategy. And now, Madison had handed her the opening she needed. The confession wasn't an act of honesty. It was a calculated move to minimize culpability. And Mendez was going to dismantle it, piece by piece. Mendez approached the witness stand slowly, her expression neutral. She didn't look angry. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like someone who'd been waiting patiently for the truth and was finally about to extract it. She started with a simple question. "When did you decide to tell the truth, Madison?" Madison shifted in her seat. She said she'd wanted to tell the truth from the beginning but had been scared. Mendez nodded, then pulled out a transcript of Madison's first police interview. She read aloud Madison's exact words from that day. "I wasn't at Rachel's house. I was home studying. I went to bed early. I didn't see her." Mendez looked up. "That doesn't sound like someone who wanted to tell the truth. That sounds like someone who was lying." Madison's jaw tightened. She said she was in shock. She wasn't thinking clearly. Mendez moved on. She asked about the drive Madison claimed she'd taken to clear her head. The one that placed her 3 blocks from Rachel's house at the exact time Rachel died. Madison said she'd driven past, but she hadn't stopped. Then Mendez asked why Madison's fingerprints were on the broken picture frame inside Rachel's bedroom if she'd only driven past. Madison stammered. She said she'd already explained that. She'd been at Rachel's house earlier. Mendez shook her head. The forensic analysis determined those prints were fresh, less than 24 hours old. You were in that room the night Rachel died. Madison's voice rose slightly. She said that's what she'd just admitted. She'd gone inside. They'd argued. But it was an accident. Mendez paused, letting the word hang in the air. Accident. She asked Madison to describe exactly what happened. Madison took a breath, then recounted the story she'd just told. She said Rachel had been upset. They'd argued. Madison had reached for her arm. Rachel had pulled away. She'd stumbled backward and hit her head. Mendez listened, then asked a single, devastating question. "If it was an accident, why didn't you call 911? The courtroom went silent. Madison opened her mouth, closed it, then said she panicked. She didn't know what to do. Mendez's voice remained calm but firm. "You knew exactly what to do. You're an honors student. You've taken health classes. You know CPR. You had a phone in your pocket. But instead of calling for help, you left Rachel on the floor and went home." Madison's eyes filled with tears. She said she was scared. Mendez leaned forward slightly. "Scared of what?" "Scared of facing consequences for what you'd done." Mendez pulled out Madison's phone records. She showed the jury a timeline. Madison's phone had been at Rachel's house from 11:43 until 11:59. 16 minutes. Mendez asked what Madison had been doing during that time if Rachel had fallen almost immediately. Madison said she'd tried to wake her up. She'd shaken her, called her name. Mendez asked if she'd checked for a pulse. Madison said she didn't think so. She was in shock. Mendez asked if she'd attempted CPR. Madison said no. She didn't know if she should move her. Mendez's expression didn't change, but her tone sharpened. "So for 16 minutes, you stood in that room, watching Rachel die, and did nothing to save her. Then you left, locked the door, and drove home." Madison's tears spilled over. She said it wasn't like that. Mendez asked what it was like then. Madison had no answer. Next, Mendez addressed the deleted text messages, the ones where Madison had written that she wished she could take it back. Mendez read them aloud, slowly, letting each word sink in. Madison tried to explain them away, saying she just meant she wished the whole situation had never happened. Mendez asked why she deleted them if they were so innocent. Madison said she deleted lots of messages. It didn't mean anything. Mendez pulled up more records showing that Madison had specifically deleted only the messages related to Rachel in the days following her death. Everything else remained on her phone. That's not random deletion, that's covering your tracks. Mendez moved to the note found in Rachel's room. The handwritten note that forensic analysts had confirmed was written by Madison. Mendez held it up for the jury to see. "You wrote that Rachel was selfish, that she was throwing away your friendship, that you deserved better." Madison nodded. She said she'd been upset. Friends fight. Mendez asked when Madison had written it. Madison said she couldn't remember exactly, maybe a few days before. Mendez reminded her that the forensic analysis of the ink showed it was written within hours of Rachel's death. The paper had been fresh, the pen impressions deep. This wasn't written days before. This was written that night, likely right before you went to her house. Madison's voice cracked. She said maybe it was. She'd been upset. She'd wanted Rachel to understand how she felt. Mendez asked if Madison had brought the note with her when she went to Rachel's house. Madison said she might have. She couldn't remember. Mendez asked if she'd given it to Rachel. Madison said no. She'd probably dropped it during the argument. Mendez pressed. "So you went to Rachel's house with a note accusing her of being selfish to confront her about ending your friendship. You argued. Things got physical, and Rachel ended up dead. But you want this jury to believe it was just an accident." Madison's composure finally cracked completely. She said she didn't mean for it to happen. She never wanted Rachel to get hurt. She just wanted to talk. She just wanted things to go back to the way they were. Mendez's voice softened, but only slightly. She asked Madison if she understood what her choices had cost. Rachel's father found his daughter on the floor the next morning. Rachel's little brother lost his sister. A community lost a bright, kind young woman who had her whole life ahead of her. And all of that could have been prevented if you'd done the right thing that night. If you'd called for help. If you'd told the truth. If you'd put Rachel's life above your own fear. Madison sobbed openly now, her hands covering her face. Mendez let the moment sit, then returned to the prosecution table. She had no more questions. She didn't need them. Madison had already told the jury everything they needed to know. Calloway tried to redirect, to salvage what he could. He asked Madison if she'd intended to hurt Rachel. Madison said no, emphatically. He asked if she regretted what happened. Madison said every day. She said she lived with it every moment. She wished she could go back and change everything. But Calloway's questions couldn't undo the damage Mendez had done. The jury had seen Madison lie, deflect, and minimize. They'd heard her admit to leaving Rachel to die. They'd watched her cry, but tears weren't the same as accountability. And as Madison stepped down from the stand for the final time, the weight of her testimony hung over the courtroom like a storm cloud ready to break. The defense had nothing left. The prosecution had proven its case beyond any reasonable doubt. Now all that remained was for 12 ordinary people to decide whether Madison Pierce would face the consequences of the choice she'd made that terrible night. The trial had stretched over 2 weeks, but it felt like months. The courtroom had become a second home for everyone involved. Rachel's family sat in the same seats every day, their grief a constant presence. Madison's parents looked hollowed out, aging visibly with each passing hour. The jury had absorbed testimony, evidence, and emotion until they looked exhausted by the weight of it all. And now, as both sides prepared their closing arguments, the end was finally in sight. One last chance for each attorney to shape the narrative. One last opportunity to sway 12 minds before they disappeared into deliberation. Mendez stood first. She'd dressed simply that morning, a dark suit with minimal jewelry, nothing to distract from her words. She walked to the center of the courtroom and looked at each juror individually before she began. She thanked them for their service, for their attention, for taking this responsibility seriously. Then she told them what this case was really about. "It's about choices," she said. "The choice Madison Pierce made when she went to Rachel's house that night. The choice she made when she let anger override reason. The choice she made when she left Rachel dying on the floor. And the choice she made every single day afterward when she looked people in the eye and lied about what she'd done." Mendez walked them through the evidence one more time, not in exhaustive detail, but hitting the key points that mattered most. The fingerprints that proved Madison had been in that room. The cell phone data that placed her there at the exact time Rachel died. The text messages that showed obsession and rage. The note that revealed her state of mind. The witness testimony from friends who'd seen Madison's jealousy spiral out of control. And most powerfully, the testimony from Madison's own mother, who'd chosen truth over protecting her daughter. Mendez said that took courage. The kind of courage Madison should have shown that night when she had the chance to save Rachel's life. She reminded them of Dr. Chen's testimony. The defensive wounds on Rachel's arms. The fibers under her fingernails. The blunt force trauma that came from a violent altercation, not a simple accident. Mendez said, "Accidents are what happen when you spill coffee or forget to set your alarm." What happened to Rachel Thornton was the result of rage, of obsession, of someone who couldn't accept being told no. Madison went to that house to confront Rachel. She brought a note filled with accusations. And when Rachel didn't respond the way Madison wanted, when Rachel told her to leave, Madison snapped. The physical evidence proves it. The timeline proves it. And Madison's own words, her own lies, prove it. Mendez addressed the defense's argument that this was just a tragic accident. She asked the jury to think about what happened after Rachel fell. Madison admitted she stood there for 16 minutes. She had her phone. She could have called 911. She could have tried CPR. She could have run to a neighbor's house screaming for help. But she didn't do any of those things. Instead, she made a calculated decision. She wiped her hands, turned off the light, walked out of that room, locked the door behind her, and drove home. Then she went to bed. She woke up the next morning and went about her day. And when Rachel's father found his daughter's body, Madison acted shocked. She cried at all the right moments. She offered sympathy and support. She lied to police, to friends, to everyone. That's not panic. That's not shock. That's consciousness of guilt. Mendez's voice grew quieter but more intense. She said Rachel Thornton was 17 years old. She had dreams of becoming a nurse. She wanted to travel the world. She took care of her little brother and helped her father hold their family together after their mother died. She was kind to neighbors, generous with friends, and beloved by everyone who knew her. And now she's gone. Not because of some unavoidable tragedy, not because of fate or bad luck, but because Madison Pierce decided that if she couldn't have Rachel's friendship, no one could. Because Madison's ego, her jealousy, her need for control mattered more than Rachel's life. Mendez walked over to where Rachel's father sat. She didn't point, didn't make a show of it, but the gesture was clear. She said, "David Thornton goes to sleep every night knowing his daughter died alone and scared. Owen Thornton is growing up without his sister. A community is mourning a loss that never should have happened. And the person responsible for all of that is sitting at the defense table, still trying to minimize what she did, still making excuses, still putting herself first." Mendez turned back to the jury. She said they had the power to deliver justice, not revenge, not emotion, just simple, clear-eyed justice based on the evidence they'd heard. She asked them to hold Madison Pierce accountable for her choices. She asked them to give Rachel's family the truth they deserved. And she asked them to send a message that no one, no matter how young or polished or promising, gets to take a life and walk away unpunished. Mendez returned to her seat. The courtroom was silent. Then Calloway stood. He looked tired, like a man who'd been fighting uphill for 2 weeks and knew the ground was slipping beneath him. But he was a professional. He had a job to do. He walked to the jury box and began with an appeal to their sense of fairness. He said this case had been emotional from the start. A young woman was dead. A family was grieving. And it was natural to want someone to pay for that. But he reminded them that justice wasn't about making people feel better. It was about following the law. And the law required proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Not suspicion, not probability, certainty. Calloway said the prosecution had presented a lot of evidence. He didn't dispute that. But he asked the jury to look at what that evidence actually proved versus what the prosecution wanted them to believe it proved. Yes, Madison's fingerprints were on the picture frame. But fingerprints don't have timestamps. They prove she touched the frame, not when. Yes, her phone pinged near Rachel's house. But cell tower data isn't GPS. The radius covered several blocks. Yes, she sent emotional text messages. But since when is being upset a crime? He said the prosecution had taken circumstantial evidence and woven it into a story that felt compelling. But feeling true and being proven true are not the same thing. He addressed Madison's admission that she'd been at Rachel's house that night. He said, yes, she should have told the truth from the beginning. Yes, she made mistakes. But mistakes born from fear and panic don't make someone a murderer. He said Madison and Rachel had argued. Things got physical. Rachel fell. It was a tragedy, a horrible, heartbreaking accident, but it wasn't murder. Madison didn't go there with intent to harm. She went there to talk, to salvage a friendship. And when things spiraled out of control, she panicked. She made the worst decision of her life by leaving instead of calling for help. But bad decisions don't equal criminal intent. Calloway said Madison was 18 years old. Her brain wasn't fully developed. She'd never been in trouble before. She'd spent her entire life being a good student, a good daughter, a good friend. One terrible night, one tragic mistake shouldn't define the rest of her existence. He said the prosecution wanted the jury to see Madison as a monster, but she wasn't. She was a scared teenager who made catastrophic errors in judgment. She would have to live with that for the rest of her life. The question wasn't whether she made mistakes. The question was whether those mistakes rose to the level of murder, and Calloway said they didn't. He asked the jury to remember reasonable doubt, to remember that the burden of proof was on the prosecution, and to remember that punishment should fit the crime, not the emotion. He sat down. The courtroom remained quiet. Judge Holt gave final instructions to the jury. He explained the charges, the standards of proof, the definitions of terms like intent and malice. He told them to deliberate carefully, to consider only the evidence presented, and to reach a verdict based on facts, not feelings. Then he dismissed them. The jury filed out, 12 faces showing strain and exhaustion. The courtroom slowly emptied. Rachel's family left through one door, Madison's through another, and Madison herself was led back to the holding area to wait. The trial was over. The evidence had been presented. The arguments had been made. Now the only thing left was the verdict. And in a small deliberation room down the hall, 12 strangers were about to decide whether Madison Pierce would spend the next decades of her life in prison, or whether she'd somehow find a way back to the future she'd once believed was guaranteed. The jury room was smaller than most people imagined. A long table, 12 chairs, beige walls with nothing on them except a clock that seemed to tick louder than it should. The jurors filed in quietly, each taking a seat, no one quite ready to be the first to speak. They'd spent 2 weeks sitting in silence, absorbing information, watching faces, taking notes. Now they had to turn all of that into a decision that would determine the course of 2 lives. Rachel's, which had already ended, and Madison's, which hung in the balance. The foreman was a man named Richard, mid-50s, an engineer who'd approached every day of testimony with the same methodical attention he brought to his work. He cleared his throat and suggested they start with a preliminary vote, just to see where everyone stood. No pressure, no judgment, just a baseline. He passed out slips of paper. Each juror wrote down their initial feeling, guilty or not guilty. When Richard collected and counted them, the result was 9 guilty, 3 not guilty. It wasn't unanimous, but it was a clear majority. The question now was whether those 3 could be persuaded or whether they'd deadlock. One of the not guilty votes came from a woman named Susan, a retired teacher in her 60s. She spoke softly but firmly. She said she believed Madison had been in Rachel's room that night. She believed they'd argued. She even believed Madison had left Rachel there without calling for help. But she wasn't sure it was murder. Murder required intent, and she hadn't seen proof that Madison intended to kill Rachel. It looked like a fight that went wrong, a terrible accident. She said Madison should face consequences, but murder felt too extreme. Several other jurors nodded, not necessarily in agreement, but in acknowledgement that the question of intent was complicated. A man named Marcus, a postal worker in his 30s, spoke next. He was one of the guilty votes. He said he understood Susan's point, but he didn't agree with it. He said Madison's actions after Rachel fell showed intent. Not intent to kill, maybe, but intent to let Rachel die. He said leaving someone injured and unconscious without calling for help was a choice. A conscious, deliberate choice. And that choice had consequences. If Madison had called 911 immediately, maybe Rachel would have survived. Maybe the doctors could have done something. But Madison took that chance away. She prioritized her own freedom over Rachel's life. That, Marcus said, was enough. Another not guilty vote came from a younger woman named Jessica, mid-20s, who'd been watching Madison closely throughout the trial. She said she kept thinking about how young Madison was, 18, still technically a teenager. She said people that age make impulsive decisions. Their brains aren't fully formed. She wasn't excusing what Madison did, but she wondered if this was really the same as an adult committing premeditated murder. She said maybe there should be different standards for young people who panic and make terrible choices versus adults who plan and execute crimes. Several jurors shook their heads. Age didn't erase responsibility. 18 was old enough to know that leaving someone to die was wrong. The conversation went on for hours. They reviewed the evidence piece by piece, the fingerprints, the cell phone data, the text messages, the testimony from Madison's mother, which several jurors said had been the turning point for them. One woman said she'd been on the fence until Catherine Pierce took the stand. A mother testifying against her own daughter carried weight. It meant the lies had become too much even for family to bear. Another juror agreed. He said Catherine's testimony showed courage and integrity. If Madison's own mother couldn't defend her, how could they? They talked about the deleted text messages, the ones where Madison said she wished she could take it back. Several jurors felt that phrasing was damning. You don't say you wish you could take back something you didn't do. You say that when you regret an action. Others argued it was ambiguous. Maybe Madison just meant she wished she'd handled the friendship differently. Maybe she meant she wished she'd never gone to Rachel's house that night. The interpretation could go either way. But when they looked at it in context with everything else, the pattern became harder to ignore. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction, and patterns mattered. They discussed Madison's testimony, her admission that she'd been in the room when Rachel fell, her explanation that it was an accident. Some jurors felt sympathy for her. She'd cried. She'd expressed regret. But others, including Richard, said tears weren't the same as accountability. Madison had lied for months. She'd only admitted the truth when the evidence made denial impossible. That wasn't remorse. That was damage control. And the fact that she'd left Rachel there, that she'd locked the door and gone home and slept in her own bed while Rachel's father worked a night shift, that showed a level of selfishness that was hard to reconcile with innocence. By late afternoon, they took another vote. This time, it was 10 guilty, 2 not guilty. Susan had been persuaded by the discussion about Madison's actions after the fall. She said she still wasn't sure Madison intended to hurt Rachel, but she agreed that leaving her to die was a choice that deserved punishment. That left Jessica and one other juror, a man named Tom, who'd been quiet most of the day. Tom finally spoke. He said he was struggling because he had a daughter Madison's age. He kept imagining his daughter in that courtroom, scared and alone. He said he didn't know if he could vote to send someone so young to prison for what might have been a terrible mistake. Marcus responded gently but firmly. He said he understood that instinct. But this wasn't about Tom's daughter. This was about Rachel Thornton. She'd been young, too. She'd had a future, too. And Madison had taken that away. Whether it was intentional or not, Rachel was dead because of Madison's actions and choices. Tom nodded slowly. He said he needed more time to think. Richard suggested they break for the evening and return fresh the next morning. Judge Holt had told them there was no rush. They should take as long as they needed to reach a fair verdict. The next morning, they reconvened. Tom looked like he hadn't slept. He said he'd spent the whole night thinking about the evidence, about Rachel, about Madison, about what justice really meant. He said he'd come to a conclusion. He believed Madison was guilty, not of planning to kill Rachel, but of causing her death through reckless, selfish actions and then covering it up. He said the lies, the deleted messages, the way Madison had let Rachel's family suffer without answers, all of it showed a level of moral failure that couldn't be excused by age or panic. He said it was one of the hardest decisions he'd ever made, but he believed it was the right one. That left Jessica. She sat quietly, looking down at her hands. The room waited. Finally, she spoke. She said she still felt conflicted, but she also recognized that her feelings didn't change the facts. The evidence was overwhelming. Madison had been there. She'd fought with Rachel. She'd left her to die. She'd lied about it repeatedly. And when she finally told the truth, it was only because she had no other choice. Jessica said she didn't know if she'd call it murder in the traditional sense, but she knew Madison was responsible. She knew Rachel deserved justice, and she knew that meant holding Madison accountable. She took a deep breath. She said she was ready to vote guilty. Richard called for a final vote. He asked each juror individually. One by one, they answered, "Guilty, guilty, guilty." All 12, unanimous. The decision had been made. They informed the bailiff they'd reached a verdict. Word spread quickly through the courthouse. Within 30 minutes, the courtroom was packed again. Rachel's family filed back in, holding hands, bracing themselves. Madison's parents looked gray, defeated. Madison herself was brought in from the holding area, her face pale, her hands trembling. She sat at the defense table, Calloway beside her, both of them knowing what was coming but unable to stop it. Judge Holt entered. The room rose, and the foreman stood, holding a single piece of paper that would determine the rest of Madison Pierce's life. Judge Holt settled into his chair, and looked across the courtroom. The silence was absolute. Not a cough, not a whisper. Just the faint hum of the ventilation system and the sound of people breathing. He asked if the jury had reached a verdict. Richard, the foreman, stood and said they had. The judge asked him to hand the verdict form to the bailiff. The piece of paper made its journey from Richard's hand to the bailiff to the judge. Holt unfolded it, read it without expression, then handed it back. He asked the defendant to rise. Madison stood slowly, her legs unsteady. Calloway rose beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder for support. Behind them, Catherine Pierce sat with her hands clasped in prayer position, pressed against her lips. Her husband stared straight ahead, unable to look at his daughter. Across the aisle, David Thornton held his son close, one arm wrapped around Owen's shoulders. The boy was too young to fully understand what was happening, but he could feel the weight of it. Everyone could. Judge Holt addressed the foreman. He asked him to read the verdict aloud. Richard cleared his throat, looked down at the paper in his hands, then lifted his eyes to meet Madison's. His voice was steady, clear, and final. On the charge of second-degree murder in the death of Rachel Marie Thornton, we the jury find the defendant, Madison Elizabeth Pierce, guilty. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, everything happened at once. Madison's knees buckled. Calloway caught her, holding her upright. She shook her head, mouthing the word no over and over, but no sound came out. Behind her, Catherine let out a sob that sounded like it had been ripped from somewhere deep inside her. Her husband remained frozen, his face blank with shock. On the other side of the courtroom, David Thornton closed his eyes and pulled his son closer. Tears ran down his face, silent and steady. Owen asked quietly what guilty meant. David whispered that it meant the person who hurt Rachel was going to be held responsible. The boy nodded, not really understanding, but accepting it because his father said so. Judge Holt gavelled for order as murmurs spread through the gallery. He thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. They filed out quietly, several of them looking emotionally drained, a few wiping at their eyes. They'd done their job. They'd weighed the evidence. They'd reached a unanimous decision. But that didn't make it easy. Deciding someone's fate, even when the evidence was clear, took a toll. They would carry this case with them for the rest of their lives. Some would talk about it, others would try to forget. But none of them would ever fully shake the memory of Madison Pierce's face when the verdict was read. Judge Holt set a sentencing date for 3 weeks later. He remanded Madison into custody. The bailiffs approached the defense table. Madison turned to look at her mother one last time. Catherine stood, reaching out, but Madison was already being led away. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. The confident girl who'd walked into this courtroom 2 weeks ago now replaced by someone who finally understood that her lies had consequences. The courtroom doors closed behind her with a heavy metallic sound, and just like that, she was gone. The gallery began to empty. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Rachel's friends hugged each other, crying with relief and sadness. David Thornton stood and shook Mendez's hand, thanking her for fighting for his daughter. Mendez said she was just doing her job, but they both knew it was more than that. This case had mattered. Rachel had mattered. And now, finally, there was some measure of justice, not closure. David would never have closure. His daughter was still gone. But at least he had truth. At least Madison wouldn't walk away pretending none of it had happened. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy was immediate. Cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust forward. David Thornton stood at a podium that had been set up on the steps, a prepared statement in his hand. He spoke slowly, his voice thick with emotion. He said the verdict wouldn't bring Rachel back. Nothing would. But it did mean that her life had been valued, that her death had been taken seriously, and that the person responsible would be held accountable. He said he hoped Madison would use her time in prison to reflect on what she'd done, to find genuine remorse, and to understand the cost of the choices she'd made. He said he forgave her, not because she deserved it, but because carrying hatred would only add to the weight his family was already bearing. Then he thanked the jury, the prosecution, and everyone who'd supported them through the darkest months of their lives. Mendez gave a brief statement as well. She said the justice system wasn't perfect, but in this case, it had worked. The evidence had been presented fairly, the jury had deliberated thoughtfully, and the verdict reflected the truth of what happened the night Rachel died. She said she hoped this case would remind people that actions have consequences, that lies always come to light, and that no one is above accountability. She said Rachel Thornton deserved to be remembered not for how she died, but for how she lived, with kindness, with generosity, with a belief that people were fundamentally good. And it was a tragedy that someone Rachel trusted had betrayed that belief in the worst possible way. The Pierce family left through a side entrance, avoiding the cameras. Catherine walked with her head down, her husband guiding her by the elbow. They would face their own reckoning in the days to come. Questions from neighbors, whispers at the grocery store, the knowledge that their daughter was a convicted killer. Catherine's testimony had been the right thing to do, but it had cost her. She'd saved her integrity and lost her daughter in the process. Or maybe she'd lost her daughter long before that, the night Madison chose lies over truth, self-preservation over saving a life. Either way, the woman who walked out of that courthouse was different from the one who'd walked in. Grief and guilt had carved new lines in her face, and they would never fully fade. Back inside the empty courtroom, the court reporter packed up her equipment. The bailiff straightened the chairs. The judge's clerk collected documents for the case file. It was just another trial to them. Another day in a system that processed tragedy and turned it into legal outcomes. But for everyone else involved, this case would echo for years. Rachel's family would build their lives around the hole she'd left behind. Madison would serve her sentence and try to make sense of what she'd done. The jurors would wonder occasionally if they'd made the right call, though most would feel confident they had. And somewhere in the courthouse archives, this case would sit in a box, a record of one night when anger became violence, violence became death, and death became justice. The courtroom lights were turned off, the doors locked, and outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Another day ending, another verdict rendered. Another reminder that the justice system, for all its flaws, sometimes gets it right. Madison Pierce had laughed off the idea that she'd face consequences. She'd believed her age, her appearance, her carefully crafted image would protect her. But in the end, the evidence spoke louder than her lies. The truth emerged despite her best efforts to bury it. And the jury, 12 ordinary people, had done the extraordinary work of holding her accountable. The gavel had fallen, the verdict was in, and justice, imperfect but real, had finally been served. The 3 weeks between the verdict and sentencing felt like an eternity for everyone involved. Madison sat in a county jail cell, no longer the confident teenager who'd walked into court believing she'd go home. The reality of her situation had finally broken through the protective shell of denial she'd built around herself. She spent her days in a small space with a metal bed, a toilet, and a tiny window that showed nothing but gray sky. Other inmates gave her a wide berth. Word traveled fast in jail about who you were and what you'd done. A girl who'd killed her best friend and lied about it wasn't someone people wanted to befriend. Madison wrote letters she never sent. Apologies to Rachel's family that felt hollow no matter how she phrased them, explanations to her parents that always devolved into excuses, reflections on what she could have done differently that night, how a single different choice could have changed everything. But the letters stayed in a stack under her mattress. What was the point? Words couldn't undo what had happened. They couldn't bring Rachel back. They couldn't erase the months of lies, and they couldn't change the fact that in a few weeks she'd stand before a judge and learn how many years of her life she'd spend behind bars. Catherine Pierce hadn't been to see her. The decision had torn her apart, but she knew that visiting Madison now would only make things harder. Catherine had done what she believed was right by testifying. She'd chosen truth over protecting her daughter's lies, but that didn't mean she'd stopped being a mother. She grieved for Madison every day, for the girl she'd raised, for the future that had been destroyed, for the moral failure that had led to this moment. She went to therapy twice a week, trying to process the guilt, the anger, the unbearable sadness of loving someone who'd done something unforgivable. Her husband went with her sometimes, but mostly he retreated into silence. Their marriage was fracturing under the weight of what their daughter had become. Rachel's family was trying to find a path forward, though forward felt like the wrong word. There was no moving past this. There was only learning to live with it. David had returned to work at the hospital, but colleagues said he seemed distant, going through the motions without really being present. Owen was in counseling, trying to process his sister's death in ways his 10-year-old mind could handle. He drew pictures of Rachel, always smiling, always with angel wings. He asked his father if Rachel could see them from heaven. David said he believed she could. He said he believed Rachel knew they loved her and missed her every single day. It was the only comfort he had to offer. The community held a memorial service for Rachel on what would have been her 18th birthday. Hundreds of people attended. Classmates shared stories about her kindness. Teachers talked about her dedication. Neighbors remembered her generosity. They planted a tree in the park, where she used to play as a child, with a plaque that read, "Rachel Marie Thornton, a light that will never fade." David stood by that tree for a long time after everyone else had left, his hand on the rough bark, thinking about all the birthdays Rachel would never have, all the milestones she'd never reach, the life she'd never get to live because someone she trusted had taken it from her. The media coverage of the trial had been extensive, but it reached a fever pitch in the days before sentencing. News programs analyzed every aspect of the case. Legal experts debated the appropriate punishment for an 18-year-old convicted of second-degree murder. Some argued for leniency, citing her age and lack of prior criminal history. Others called for the maximum sentence, saying her lies and lack of remorse warranted the harshest possible consequences. Social media was predictably divided. Some people expressed sympathy for Madison, calling her a cautionary tale about teenage brains and poor impulse control. Others condemned her viciously, saying she deserved to rot in prison for what she'd done. Mendez ignored most of the commentary. She'd prepared her sentencing recommendation and felt confident in it. She'd seen cases like this before. Young defendants who'd made terrible choices and then compounded them with lies and cover-ups. Age was a mitigating factor, sure, but it wasn't a free pass. Madison had understood right from wrong. She'd known leaving Rachel to die was morally reprehensible. She'd made a conscious choice to prioritize her own freedom over Rachel's life. That choice deserved significant consequences. Mendez would ask the judge for 20 years, with the possibility of parole after serving 85%. It was substantial, but not excessive. It would give Madison a chance at a life after prison while still holding her accountable for the life she'd taken. Calloway had a different calculus. He was preparing to ask for the minimum sentence, around 10 years, with credit for time served and good behavior potentially reducing it further. He planned to emphasize Madison's youth, her lack of criminal history, her cooperation once she'd finally admitted the truth. He'd bring in a psychologist to testify about teenage brain development, about how the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. He'd argue that Madison's capacity for judgment had been compromised by her age and emotional state. It was a Hail Mary, and he knew it. Judge Holt had a reputation for being tough on defendants who lied and showed no remorse. But Calloway had to try. It was his job to advocate for his client, even when that client had made his job nearly impossible. The victim impact statements were being prepared as well. David had written his, though it had taken him a dozen drafts to find words that felt adequate. How do you summarize the loss of a child in a few paragraphs? How do you make a judge understand the magnitude of what's been taken from you? He'd decided to focus on Rachel, on who she was and what she'd meant to their family and community. He'd talk about her dreams, her kindness, her potential. He'd explain that her absence wasn't just a Personal loss, but a loss to everyone who would have been touched by her life if she'd been allowed to live it. He'd also address Madison directly, something he'd thought long and hard about. He'd say he hoped she would find genuine remorse, that she'd spend her time in prison reflecting on the harm she'd caused and working to become a better person. He'd say he forgave her, but forgiveness didn't mean there shouldn't be consequences. Owen wanted to speak too, but David wasn't sure a 10-year-old should have to stand in front of a courtroom and talk about losing his sister. His therapist said it might be cathartic, that having a voice in the process could help with healing, but David worried it would traumatize him further. They compromised. Owen would write a letter that David would read on his behalf. Owen's letter was simple, heartbreaking in its innocence. He wrote that Rachel used to read him bedtime stories, that she made the best grilled cheese sandwiches, that she always knew how to make him laugh when he was sad. He wrote that he missed her every single day and wished she could come back. He wrote that he hoped the person who hurt her would understand how much it hurt everyone who loved her. It was 4 sentences, written in a child's uneven handwriting, and it would be one of the most powerful statements in that courtroom. As sentencing day approached, everyone involved felt the weight of what was coming. This was the final chapter of a tragedy that had unfolded over months. The verdict had established guilt. The sentence would determine the price, and no matter what Judge Holt decided, no one would walk away feeling whole. Rachel would still be gone. Madison's future would still be destroyed. 2 families would still be shattered. The justice system could provide accountability, but it couldn't provide healing. That would take time and therapy and the slow, painful work of learning to live with loss. The courtroom could deliver a sentence. Only the people involved could decide what to do with the years that followed. The courtroom was packed on sentencing day. Every seat in the gallery was filled, with more people standing along the back wall. The bailiffs had opened an overflow room where spectators could watch on a video feed. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The trial had established what happened. The verdict had assigned blame. Now Judge Holt would decide what justice looked like in concrete terms. How many years? How much time? What price Madison Pierce would pay for taking Rachel Thornton's life? Madison was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, her hands cuffed in front of her. The confident girl who'd sat at the defense table during trial was gone. 3 weeks in jail had stripped away whatever remained of her composure. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying or lack of sleep, or both. She sat between Calloway and a second attorney from his firm, both of them speaking to her in low voices, trying to prepare her for what was coming. Across the aisle, Rachel's family sat in the front row. David wore a dark suit, his jaw set with determination. Owen sat beside him, small and quiet, clutching a drawing he'd made of his sister. Behind them, friends and community members filled the rows, a silent wall of support for the family that had lost so much. Judge Holt entered, and the room rose. He settled into his chair, adjusted his glasses, and looked out over the courtroom. He said this was one of the most difficult cases he'd presided over in his career. Not because the evidence was complicated or the law unclear, but because the human cost was so profound. A young woman had lost her life, another young woman had taken it. 2 families had been destroyed, and now he had to determine a sentence that balanced punishment, deterrence, and the possibility of rehabilitation. He said he'd spent considerable time reviewing the case file, the evidence, the testimony, and the pre-sentencing reports. He'd read letters from both sides, and he'd prayed for wisdom to make the right decision. He called first for the victim impact statements. David Thornton rose slowly, a piece of paper trembling in his hand. He walked to the podium positioned between the defense and prosecution tables. He cleared his throat, looked down at his notes, then lifted his eyes to meet Judge Holt's. He began by thanking the court for the opportunity to speak. Then he talked about Rachel. He described her not as a victim, but as a person. A daughter who'd stepped up after her mother died and helped hold their family together. A sister who'd been endlessly patient with a little brother who followed her everywhere. A student who'd worked hard and dreamed big. a friend who'd been loyal and kind and generous. He said Rachel had been 17 years old, on the cusp of adulthood, with her whole life stretching out in front of her. And then Madison Pierce had taken all of that away. David's voice cracked, but he pushed through. He said the night Rachel died, she'd been home alone doing homework. She'd let someone she trusted into their house, and that person had turned on her. He said Rachel had fought back. The evidence showed that, but she'd lost. And instead of calling for help, Madison had left her there. David said he came home from his shift and found his daughter on the floor of her bedroom, cold and still, and it was a moment that had shattered his world. He said not a day went by that he didn't think about what Rachel's last moments must have been like. Was she scared? Did she call out for help? Did she wonder why no one was coming? Those thoughts haunted him. He turned to look at Madison for the first time. She kept her eyes down, unable or unwilling to meet his gaze. David said he'd struggled with anger, with hatred, with a desire for revenge. But over time, he'd realized those feelings only poisoned him further, so he'd made a choice to forgive. Not for Madison's sake, but for his own. He said forgiveness didn't mean what Madison did was okay. It didn't mean there shouldn't be consequences. It meant he was choosing not to let her actions define the rest of his life. He said he hoped Madison would spend her time in prison finding genuine remorse, understanding the true weight of what she'd done, and becoming someone who could contribute positively to the world if she was ever released. But that was for her to decide. His job was to honor Rachel's memory and make sure she was never forgotten. David returned to his seat, his hands shaking. Owen handed him the drawing, and David held it carefully as he read Owen's letter aloud. The simple, heartfelt words of a child who missed his sister cut through the courtroom like a knife. Several jurors who'd returned to watch the sentencing wiped at their eyes. Even the bailiffs, who'd seen hundreds of these proceedings, looked affected. When David finished and sat down, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The weight of Rachel's absence filled every corner of that space. Judge Holt called next for the defense's mitigation case. Calloway stood and called a forensic psychologist who'd evaluated Madison. The psychologist testified about adolescent brain development, about how the parts of the brain responsible for impulse control and long-term thinking don't fully mature until the mid-20s. She said Madison's capacity for judgment at 18 was not the same as an adult's. She described how panic and fear can override rational decision-making, especially in young people. She said Madison's choice to leave Rachel without calling for help was reprehensible, but it was consistent with how an immature brain responds to crisis. Self-preservation overriding moral responsibility. It wasn't an excuse, the psychologist emphasized, but it was context. Calloway then called Madison to speak on her own behalf. It was a risk. She'd already testified during trial, and her performance there hadn't been strong. But Calloway believed the judge needed to hear remorse directly from her. Madison stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She walked to the podium and gripped its edges like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She looked at Judge Holt, then at Rachel's family, then back down at her hands. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. The judge asked her to speak up. She tried again, louder this time, but still shaking. Madison said she knew nothing she could say would make this better. She said she'd destroyed Rachel's family, destroyed her own family, destroyed 2 lives with her actions that night. She said she thought about Rachel every day, about the fight, about the moment Rachel fell, about the choice she'd made to leave. She said she wished more than anything she could go back and change it. She said she should have called for help. She should have tried to save Rachel. She should have been honest from the beginning. But she'd been scared and selfish and stupid, and those choices had cost Rachel her life. Madison's voice broke completely. She said she was sorry, that she knew sorry wasn't enough, that it would never be enough, but it was all she had. She said she hoped Rachel's family could find peace somehow, and that she would spend the rest of her life trying to become someone worthy of the second chance Rachel never got. She sat down, sobbing openly. Calloway put a hand on her shoulder. Across the aisle, David's expression hadn't changed. Owen watched Madison cry with a confused look on his face, like he couldn't understand why the person who'd hurt his sister was crying when they were the ones who'd caused all the pain. Catherine Pierce, sitting in the gallery, covered her face with her hands. Her daughter had finally shown emotion, had finally expressed what seemed like genuine remorse. But it was too late. The verdict was in. The sentence was coming, and no amount of tears could change what was about to happen. Judge Holt asked if either attorney wanted to make final arguments regarding sentencing. Mendez stood and spoke briefly. She acknowledged Madison's youth and lack of prior criminal history, but she emphasized the severity of the crime, the months of lies, and the lack of remorse until Madison had no other option. She said the evidence showed a pattern of narcissism and self-preservation that went beyond typical teenage behavior. She asked for a sentence of 20 years, with parole eligibility after 17. It would give Madison a chance at a life after prison, while ensuring she faced significant consequences for her actions. Calloway argued for 10 years, emphasizing rehabilitation over punishment. He said Madison was young enough to learn from this, to change, to eventually contribute to society. He said warehousing her for decades wouldn't serve justice. It would only create another wasted life. He asked the judge to consider mercy alongside accountability, to give Madison a realistic chance at redemption. Judge Holt listened to both attorneys, made notes, then sat back in his chair. He said he'd heard enough. He was ready to render his decision. The courtroom went silent. Madison gripped the table in front of her, her knuckles white. David held Owen close. Catherine closed her eyes and whispered something that might have been a prayer. Judge Holt looked directly at Madison. He said he'd given this decision careful thought. He said Madison had taken a life through her actions and compounded that tragedy through months of deception. He said the victim impact statements had made clear the profound harm her choices had caused. But he also acknowledged she was young, that she'd shown some capacity for remorse, and that the justice system should hold space for rehabilitation even as it delivered punishment. Judge Holt announced his sentence: 15 years in state prison for second-degree murder. Madison would be eligible for parole after serving 12 years, contingent on good behavior and participation in rehabilitative programs. She would receive credit for time already served. He said he hoped she would use her time in prison to truly understand the weight of what she'd done and to become someone capable of living a meaningful, positive life if released. He said justice required consequences, but it also required hope, and he was giving her both. The gavel fell. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a period at the end of a sentence. Final and irrevocable. Madison collapsed forward, her shoulders shaking with sobs. The bailiffs moved to take her into custody. She turned one last time to look at her parents. Catherine stood, reaching out, but Madison was already being led away. And just like that, it was over.